They say home is where the heart is. But what happens when your heart becomes an unwelcome guest in what used to be your sanctuary? My name is Helen. I'm 55 years old, and I'm about to tell you a story that might sound familiar to many of you watching today. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment below telling us which city you're watching from. 6 months ago, I thought I was making the right choice. After my husband Robert passed away, the loneliness in our old house became suffocating. Every corner held his memory. Every silence echoed with conversations we'd never have again. When my son Michael suggested I move in with him, his wife Sandra, and my 8-year-old grandson Max, it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone right now," Michael had said, his voice carrying what I believed was genuine concern. "We have plenty of space, and Max would love having his grandmother around more." How naive I was to think that blood meant belonging. The first sign should have been Sandra's smile when Michael made the offer. It was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the kind that said yes, while every fiber of her being screamed no. But grief makes you desperate for connection, and I mistook tolerance for acceptance. I sold most of my furniture, keeping only the pieces that held the deepest memories. My grandmother's rocking chair, the dining table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, the china cabinet that had witnessed every holiday celebration for 30 years. These weren't just objects. They were the physical embodiment of a life well lived, of love that had grown deeper with each passing year. But when the moving truck arrived at Michael and Sandra's house, those precious pieces suddenly became clutter that didn't match the aesthetic they'd worked so hard to create. My rocking chair was relegated to the basement. The dining table was deemed too formal for their casual lifestyle. The china cabinet was banished to the garage, where my grandmother's delicate teacups gathered dust next to paint cans and garden tools. "We just don't have room for everything, Mom," Sandra explained with that practiced sympathy she'd perfected, the tone she probably used with difficult customers at her boutique. "You understand, right? We want you to feel at home, but this is still our house. Our house. Not our home where I was welcome. Our house. Where I was a temporary visitor who'd overstayed her welcome before even unpacking. My bedroom, Robert's and my bedroom furniture crammed into what had been their guest room, felt like a museum display of a life that no longer mattered. The room was small, barely large enough for the bed and dresser, with a single window that looked out onto the neighbor's fence. At night, I would lie there listening to the sounds of a family that functioned perfectly well without me, wondering how I'd become so invisible in a house where I was supposed to matter. The mornings were the worst. I've always been an early riser. 60 years of waking at dawn don't disappear just because your circumstances change. But my presence in their kitchen before they woke up became an intrusion, evidence that I didn't understand boundaries or personal space. "Helen, you don't need to be up so early," Sandra would say, tightening her bathrobe like armor as she found me sitting at their kitchen island with my coffee. "We're not morning people. Maybe you could stay in your room until after 9? Stay in my room, like a child being punished, like someone whose very existence was disruptive to their carefully orchestrated routine. I started setting my alarm for later, forcing myself to lie in bed, listening to my own breathing until I heard signs of life elsewhere in the house. But even then, my presence felt tolerated rather than welcomed. Sandra would move around me in the kitchen with the efficiency of someone working around an obstacle, never quite rude enough to complain about openly, but never warm enough to make me feel like family. And Michael? My son had become a stranger wearing a familiar face. The boy who used to crawl into my lap with skinned knees and broken toys had grown into a man who seemed embarrassed by my very existence. He spoke to me in the tone people use with elderly relatives they visit out of obligation, polite, distant, counting the minutes until the interaction could end naturally. "How are you settling in, Mom?" he'd ask during dinner. But his eyes were always on his phone, his attention divided between my answer and whatever work email demanded his immediate response. I would tell him about my day, the book I was reading, the garden I'd started in the small patch of yard they'd reluctantly allowed me to use, the phone call from my old neighbor who missed our morning walks. But I could see his interest fading with each word. his responses becoming shorter and more distracted until the conversation died a natural death in the space between us. The worst part was watching my relationship with Max deteriorate day by day. This child who used to run to me with arms wide open, who begged for bedtime stories and insisted I make his favorite cookies, began treating me with the same polite distance his parents modeled. 8-year-olds are sponges, absorbing not just words but the emotions behind them. When his parents spoke to me with barely concealed irritation, Max learned to do the same. When they treated my stories as interruptions rather than treasures, he stopped asking to hear them. "Grandma Helen is old-fashioned," I heard Sandra tell him one afternoon when she thought I was napping. "She doesn't understand how things work now. Sometimes old people get confused about things." Old people. Confused. As if my 55 years of experience, of raising children and managing a household and supporting my husband through career changes and family crises, had somehow made me incapable of understanding the modern world. That night, I sat in my small room surrounded by the remnants of my life, and I cried for the first time since Robert's funeral. Not the cleansing tears of grief, but the bitter tears of someone who'd discovered they'd become unwelcome in their own family. I was living in a house where every conversation stopped when I entered a room, where my opinions were dismissed with patronizing smiles, where my grandson was being taught to see me as a burden rather than a blessing. But I had no idea that the worst was yet to come, or that salvation would arrive in the most unexpected way, whispered by the smallest voice in the house, hidden under a kitchen table, where truth waited to be discovered. The first crack in what remained of my dignity came during Sandra's book club meeting. She'd been hosting these gatherings for 3 years, turning their living room into a sophisticated salon where educated women discussed literature over expensive wine and artisanal cheese. I'd always admired how Sandra curated these events. Fresh flowers arranged just so, soft lighting that made everyone look younger, conversation that flowed from Virginia Woolf to weekend plans with effortless grace. When she mentioned they were reading The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo that month, my heart lifted. I'd read it twice and loved it. "Maybe I could join you ladies," I suggested during breakfast, trying to keep my voice casual. "I've read the book, and I'd love to discuss it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sandra stopped mid-chew, her whole body freezing like a deer caught in headlights. Michael looked up from his phone for the first time in weeks, but not with interest. With panic. "Oh," Sandra finally managed, her voice artificially bright. Well, the thing is, Helen, this group has been together for so long. We have our rhythm, our inside jokes. It might be awkward to add someone new at this point. Someone new. As if I were a stranger who'd wandered in off the street, not her mother-in-law who'd been living under their roof for months. "I understand," I lied, swallowing the rejection along with my pride. But I didn't understand. These were educated, accomplished women. Surely they could make space for one more voice, especially one that actually had something to contribute. The night of the book club, I retreated to my room early, listening through thin walls as laughter drifted up from below. They discussed themes of reinvention and female power while I lay alone, feeling more powerless than I had since Robert's diagnosis. But it was what I heard Sandra say during cleanup that truly broke something inside me. "God, can you imagine if I'd said yes?" she whispered to her friend Michelle, their voices carrying through the heating vent. She would have dominated the whole conversation with some outdated perspective about marriage and sacrifice. These women come from such a different generation. They don't understand nuance. Michelle laughed, a sound like breaking glass. At least she asked instead of just showing up. My mother-in-law once crashed my dinner party and spent 2 hours lecturing my guests about proper table manners. "The worst part is how she looks at me," Sandra continued, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Like she's judging everything I do. The way I parent Max, the way I keep house, the way I talk to Michael. She probably thinks I'm not good enough for her precious son. If only she knew how desperately I wanted to approve of her, to find reasons to appreciate the woman my son had chosen. If only she realized that my looks weren't judgment, but longing to be included, to matter, to have my decades of experience valued rather than dismissed." The exclusion spread like a virus through every aspect of their social life. When Michael's colleagues came for dinner, I was introduced with the kind of apologetic smile usually reserved for explaining broken appliances. "This is my mother, Helen," he'd say, the words carrying invisible disclaimers. "She's temporary. She's not usually here. Please don't judge us by her presence." His friends, successful men and women in their 30s and 40s, would shake my hand politely before turning their attention back to conversations about market trends and vacation homes, their body language making it clear that I was peripheral to their sophisticated circle. I began eating dinner in my room, claiming fatigue to spare everyone the awkwardness of including me in conversations where I clearly didn't belong. Sandra seemed relieved by this development, no longer needing to navigate around my presence at her perfectly set table. The breaking point came during Max's parent-teacher conference. I'd been looking forward to this for weeks, remembering how Robert and I had attended every single one of Michael's conferences, how proud we'd been to hear about his progress and potential. "Would you like me to come?" I asked Sandra, who was organizing her purse and gathering the forms teachers always required. Her pause was longer than necessary, her smile more strained than usual. "That's really sweet of you to offer, Helen, but I think it might be confusing for Mrs. Patterson. She's expecting Max's parents, not his grandmother." Parents. The word hit me like a physical blow. I was Max's grandmother, yes, but I was also the woman who'd raised the father this teacher would be meeting. I was the one who'd taught Michael to read, who'd helped him with homework at this very kitchen table, who'd celebrated every academic achievement and worried through every struggle. But I wasn't his parent anymore. I wasn't even important enough to warrant inclusion in discussions about my grandson's education. That evening, I waited up to hear about the conference, hoping Sandra might share some detail about Max's progress, some small way I could feel connected to his world. "How did it go?" I asked when they returned, noting the satisfied expressions on both their faces. "Really well," Michael replied, already heading toward the stairs. "Max is doing great, right on track." That was it. No details about his reading level, his friendships, his challenges or triumphs. Just a dismissive summary that made it clear my curiosity wasn't welcome. Later that week, I discovered that Sandra had scheduled Max for summer activities without consulting me. Soccer camp, swimming lessons, art classes that would keep him busy and away from home for most of July and August. "I thought you might appreciate having more quiet time," she explained when I asked about the packed schedule. "I know how tiring it can be, having a child around constantly." Tiring. She thought my grandson's presence was tiring rather than the brightest part of my increasingly isolated days. The final blow came from Max himself, delivered with the casual cruelty that only children can manage. I'd been working in my small garden, trying to coax tomatoes and herbs from the narrow strip of earth Sandra had reluctantly allocated to me, when Max approached with his friend Tommy from next door. "That's my grandma," I heard Max explain, his voice carrying the same apologetic tone his father used. "She lives with us now because she's too old to take care of herself, too old to take care of myself, at 55, as if I were some doddering ancient who needed supervision to remember to eat or bathe." Tommy, blessed with the honesty of 8-year-olds, asked the question that hung in the air. "Why doesn't she live in one of those old people places?" Max shrugged, pulling his friend toward their bikes. "My mom says maybe someday she will, when they find a good one." I knelt there in the dirt, my hands still buried in soil that now felt like quicksand, understanding with perfect clarity that my future was being discussed and decided without my input, that I'd become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. That night, I called my sister Margaret in Phoenix, desperate for a voice that would remember me as someone other than a burden. "You sound different, Helen," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "Tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" How could I explain that taking care of myself had become impossible when every aspect of my existence was treated as an imposition? How could I tell her that the family I'd sacrificed everything to support now saw me as dead weight they were obligated to carry? "I'm fine," I lied, because admitting the truth would make it real in ways I wasn't ready to face. But I wasn't fine. I was disappearing, piece by piece, day by day, in a house where love had been replaced by tolerance, and family bonds had become chains that bound me to people who wished I would simply fade away. What I didn't know was that someone in that house was watching, listening, and preparing to change everything. The morning I found my wedding photo face down in the donation box, something inside me cracked beyond repair. I'd been looking for my reading glasses, checking the usual places where I might have left them, when I discovered the cardboard box tucked behind the coats in the hallway closet. My heart stopped when I recognized my grandmother's silver frame peeking out from beneath a pile of clothing. There it was, the photograph Robert and I had treasured for 32 years. The one where we're cutting our wedding cake, both of us laughing at something his brother had just whispered. My dress, simple but elegant, borrowed from my cousin because we couldn't afford new. His suit, rented but pressed to perfection. Two young people who believed love could conquer anything, face down, in a donation box, like garbage. I lifted it with trembling hands, studying our young faces, remembering the weight of Robert's wedding ring as I'd slipped it onto his finger, promising to love him in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. We'd kept both promises, right until the end. "Oh!" Sandra's voice made me jump. She'd appeared in the hallway, her arms full of towels, her face cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally irritation. "I didn't realize you were looking through there." "This is my wedding photo," I said, holding it up like evidence in a trial. "With Robert." "I know," she said quickly, setting the towels aside. We don't really have wall space for it, and I thought maybe someone else could enjoy it. Someone who might appreciate vintage photography." Vintage photography. My marriage reduced to an aesthetic choice someone had rejected. "Sandra, this isn't decoration. This is my life," she sighed, the sound carrying decades of frustration I was only now recognizing. "Helen, you have boxes of photos in your room. How many pictures of the same event do you really need to keep? How do you explain to someone that a photograph isn't just an image, but a doorway back to the person you used to be? That sometimes, when the present becomes unbearable, you need proof that you were once young and hopeful and deeply loved?" I took the photo back to my room and placed it on my nightstand, next to the small lamp Sandra had complained was too bright for the hallway. Every night, I would look at that picture before turning off the light, whispering goodnight to Robert as if he could somehow hear me through the years that separated us. But the donation box incident was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, I noticed other things disappearing. The throw pillow my mother had crocheted, gone from the living room sofa. The small ceramic owl Robert had bought me on our anniversary trip to Maine, missing from the kitchen windowsill. My favorite coffee mug, the one with "World's Greatest Grandma" printed in fading letters, replaced with one of Sandra's minimalist white cups. When I asked about these items, the answers were always reasonable, always delivered with that practiced patience. It didn't match the color scheme. It was taking up counter space we needed. "I thought you might want to pack it away safely." Safely. As if visibility were dangerous for anything that connected me to my past. The cruelest disappearance was my recipe box. For 30 years, I'd collected family recipes in a wooden box Robert had made in his workshop. My mother's apple pie, Sandra's own mother's famous chocolate cake, the pasta salad I'd brought to every church potluck. Each index card told a story, whose birthday it had celebrated, which holiday it had saved, which neighbor had requested the recipe after tasting it at a gathering. I discovered it was missing on a Tuesday afternoon when I'd planned to make Max's favorite cookies, snickerdoodles, the way my own grandmother had taught me, with just a hint of vanilla that made them different from everyone else's version. "Sandra, have you seen my recipe box?" I asked, checking every cabinet and drawer in their pristine kitchen. She paused in her meal prep, knife suspended over a pepper she was slicing with geometric precision. "Oh, that old thing? I threw it away last week during spring cleaning. Most of those recipes are online now anyway." Threw it away. 30 years of family history. Dozens of handwritten cards bearing the stains of countless cooking sessions. My mother's careful cursive. My own notes about adjustments and improvements. All of it in some landfill because Sandra had decided it was clutter. "Those recipes weren't just instructions," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They were family history. Helen, I can Google any recipe you want in 30 seconds. You don't need to hoard old cards to make cookies." Hoard. As if preserving memories were a mental illness rather than an act of love. That night, I tried to recreate my grandmother's snickerdoodles from memory, but they weren't right. Too much cinnamon, not enough butter, the texture all wrong. Max took one bite and made a face that told me everything I needed to know about my failure to preserve even this small piece of family tradition. The attacks on my dignity came from unexpected directions, too. Michael's friend Dave, visiting for a weekend barbecue, spent an entire afternoon explaining technology to me as if I were a toddler encountering electricity for the first time. "See, Helen, this is called a smartphone," he said, speaking slowly and loudly despite my perfectly functional hearing. "You can use it to make phone calls, but also to send text messages and look things up on the internet." I wanted to tell him that I'd been using computers since before he was born, that I'd managed Robert's entire medical team through an online portal during his illness, that I'd organized our church's fundraising database for 5 years running. Instead, I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the confused grandmother they expected me to be. "Isn't it amazing what they can do now?" Sandra chimed in, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. Helen is still getting used to all this modern technology. Still getting used to. As if I'd been raised by wolves instead of simply being born in a different decade. The most painful moments came during Max's bedtime routine. I'd always been the storyteller in our family, spinning tales that could make a sick child forget his fever or a scared child face his fears. But now, when I offered to read to Max or share one of the stories I'd told his father, I was politely redirected. "Max has very specific bedtime requirements now," Sandra would explain, as if sleep were a scientific process requiring specialized training. "We use a weighted blanket and white noise machine, and he can only handle one story from his approved book list. We don't want to overstimulate him before sleep." Overstimulate. As if my grandmother's love could somehow damage a child's ability to rest peacefully. I stood outside Max's bedroom door one evening, listening to Sandra read from a sanitized picture book about a bunny who learns to share. Her voice was competent but mechanical, hitting all the right inflections without any of the warmth that makes stories come alive in a child's imagination. Through the crack in the door, I could see Max lying perfectly still, his expression polite but distant. This was the same child who used to beg me to tell him one more story, just one more adventure about the magical kingdom where grandparents were heroes and love always conquered fear. The final humiliation came during my weekly phone call with Margaret. I'd been looking forward to our conversation all day, grateful for this 1 hour when I could speak freely with someone who remembered me as a whole person rather than a burden to be managed. But 15 minutes into our call, Sandra appeared at my bedroom door with an expression of barely controlled irritation. "Helen, could you please keep your voice down? Max is trying to do his homework and the walls are thin." My voice down. I wasn't shouting or even speaking loudly, just talking with the animation that comes naturally when reconnecting with someone you love. But my joy had become noise pollution in their perfectly controlled environment. I lowered my voice to barely above a whisper, watching Sandra nod approvingly before closing my door with the firmness of someone establishing a boundary. Margaret, who had raised 4 children and knew the sound of family dynamics, immediately picked up on the change. "What's happening there, Helen? You sound different." "Everything's fine," I lied, because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that I'd become a stranger in my own family, a ghost haunting rooms where I once belonged. But that night, as I sat in my small room surrounded by the few possessions I'd been allowed to keep, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I wasn't going to let them erase me without a fight. I just didn't know that my salvation would come from the smallest member of the family, delivered in a whisper that would finally make me visible again. The morning I woke up to find my bags packed and sitting by the front door, I knew my exile had entered its final phase. I hadn't packed them. I'd gone to bed the night before after another silent dinner where my presence had been tolerated with the kind of strained politeness reserved for unwelcome houseguests. My clothes had been folded with Sandra's characteristic precision, my toiletries arranged in a small cosmetic bag I didn't recognize. Michael stood in the kitchen, his back to me, shoulders rigid with the tension of a man preparing for an unpleasant conversation. Sandra sat at the island with a stack of brochures spread before her like tarot cards predicting my future. "We need to talk," Michael said without turning around, his voice carrying the hollow authority of someone reciting lines he'd rehearsed. "We've been looking into some options for you." Options. As if my life had become a multiple-choice question with answers I hadn't been allowed to see. Sandra pushed the brochures toward me with the enthusiasm of someone presenting a gift she knew the recipient wouldn't want. Golden Years Manor, she announced, pointing to a photograph of smiling elderly people playing what appeared to be the world's most joyous game of bingo. It has excellent reviews, 24-hour care, planned activities, nutritious meals, everything you could need. Everything I could need, except dignity, except choice, except family who wanted me around. I don't need 24-hour care, I said, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. I'm 55 years old. I take care of myself just fine. Michael finally turned to face me, and I saw guilt written across features that had once been open and loving. Mom, it's not about what you can do now. It's about planning for the future, about making sure you have support when you need it. When you need it. Not if, when. As if my decline into helplessness were inevitable and imminent rather than theoretical and distant. What about Max? I asked, grasping for the one connection I thought might still matter. What about his relationship with his grandmother? Sandra and Michael exchanged one of those married couple looks that communicate entire conversations in a single glance. She cleared her throat with the delicacy of someone about to deliver news everyone already knew was bad. Helen, we think it might actually be better for Max if he has some space to develop his own identity. He's been a little confused lately about family roles and expectations. Confused about family roles, as if loving his grandmother were somehow developmentally inappropriate. He's 8 years old, I said, hearing my voice crack despite my efforts to remain composed. 8-year-olds aren't supposed to worry about family roles. They're supposed to feel loved and supported by the adults in their lives, which is exactly why this arrangement will be better for everyone, Michael said quickly, as if speed could make his reasoning more convincing. You'll have your independence, your own space, people your own age to socialize with, and we'll visit regularly. Regularly. The word hung in the air like a lie everyone present could recognize, but no one would acknowledge. I looked at the brochures again, studying the photographs of people who'd been discarded by their families and told to be grateful for professional care. Clean rooms with hospital beds, activity directors with forced smiles, dining halls where strangers pretended to be friends because loneliness was the only alternative. I can't afford this, I said finally, because financial reality seemed like the only argument they might understand. We've worked that out, Sandra said quickly, pulling out another set of papers. Your house sale, combined with Robert's life insurance and your Social Security, should cover the first 2 years. After that, we can reassess. My house sale. They'd been planning this for months, researching facilities and calculating costs while I'd been worrying about recipe boxes and wedding photos. While I'd been trying to figure out how to become smaller and less intrusive, they'd been working on removing me entirely. When? I asked, because what was the point of fighting the inevitable? The intake appointment is Thursday, Michael said, consulting his phone as if my life were just another calendar entry requiring his attention. We thought it would be good to get you settled before Max starts school again. Fresh start for everyone. Fresh start. Code 4. We want you gone before our real life resumes. That night, I sat in my small room surrounded by the belongings they'd deemed worthy of preservation, and I tried to remember when I'd stopped fighting for my place in this family. When had I accepted that being tolerated was the best I could hope for? When had I learned to make myself so small that my own disappearance felt like a natural progression rather than a tragedy? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone who might understand, someone who might offer an alternative to the future that had been planned without my input. But the list was smaller than I'd realized. Friends from my old neighborhood who'd moved away or passed on. Church members who knew me as Robert's wife rather than as Helen. Colleagues from jobs I'd left years ago to care for family who no longer wanted my care. Margaret was dealing with her own health issues in Phoenix. My cousin Janet had dementia and wouldn't recognize my voice even if I called. The women from my old book club had their own families, their own problems, their own lives that didn't include space for a displaced grandmother seeking refuge. I was alone in a way that went beyond physical solitude. I was existentially alone, cut off from the connections that give life meaning, floating in a space between the family that no longer wanted me and a future I couldn't envision. Thursday arrived with the relentless certainty of bad news. Michael loaded my belongings into his car with the efficiency of someone completing a chore, while Sandra supervised from the porch, ensuring nothing was forgotten that might require a return trip. Max stood in the doorway, watching this dismantling of his grandmother's presence with the wide eyes of a child trying to understand adult cruelties that didn't make sense. I wanted to hug him, to explain that this wasn't his fault, that love doesn't disappear just because people do. But Sandra's hand on his shoulder felt like a barrier I wasn't allowed to cross. "Be good in school," I told him, because those might be the last words I'd speak to my grandson in his own home. He nodded solemnly, then looked up at his mother with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something passed between them, a look that seemed older than his 8 years, more knowing than a child should be. "Goodbye, Grandma Helen," he said formally, as if he'd been coached on the proper way to dismiss someone from your life. Golden Years Manor smelled like disinfectant and defeat. The intake coordinator, a cheerful woman named Beth who'd perfected the art of making institutional living sound like a luxury vacation, showed me to my new room with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed she was doing me a favor. "You'll love it here," she assured me, opening the door to reveal a space barely larger than a college dormitory. Single occupancy, private bathroom, and look at this view. The view was of the parking lot, where families dropped off their unwanted elderly like packages being returned to sender. I watched through the window as Michael's car disappeared around the corner, carrying away my last connection to the life I'd built over 5 decades. That evening, I sat in the dining hall surrounded by people who'd been discarded by their own families, all of us pretending that institutional meals served on plastic trays were adequate substitutes for kitchens where we'd once cooked with love. Conversation was limited to complaints about medications and memories of children who visited less frequently than promised. I was becoming one of them, the forgotten, the inconvenient, the women whose sacrifices had been sufficient when needed, but whose presence had become burdensome when no longer required. But as I lay in my narrow bed that first night, listening to the sounds of other people's loneliness echoing through thin walls, I realized something had shifted inside me. The despair I'd been carrying for months was transforming into something sharper, more focused. I wasn't dead yet. I wasn't helpless yet. And I still had something they'd forgotten about, something that might change everything. 3 weeks into my exile at Golden Years Manor, I received a visitor I hadn't expected, one who would remind me who I used to be before I let them convince me I was nothing. I was sitting in the common room, pretending to read while actually observing my fellow residents navigate their various stages of abandonment, when Beth approached with the bright smile she reserved for delivering news she hoped would be received as good. "Helen, you have a visitor," she announced, checking her clipboard. "A young man. Says he's your grandson." My heart stopped. Max. Somehow, impossibly, Max had found a way to see me. I followed Beth to the visiting area, a sterile space designed to facilitate brief, supervised conversations between residents and the family members who still felt obligated to maintain minimal contact. And there he was, my beautiful, serious 8-year-old grandson, sitting ramrod straight in an uncomfortable chair, his small hands folded in his lap. But he wasn't alone. Sandra sat beside him, her posture radiating the controlled tension of someone monitoring a potentially dangerous situation. She offered me her practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Hello, Helen," she said warmly, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee rather than family members whose relationship she'd systematically destroyed. "Max has been asking about you, so we thought a visit would be nice." Max has been asking about me. The words hit me like sunlight after weeks of darkness, proof that love doesn't disappear just because adults decide it's inconvenient. "Hi, Grandma Helen," Max said quietly, his eyes scanning my face as if memorizing details he might need later. "Hello, sweetheart," I managed, fighting back tears that would have alarmed Sandra and probably ended the visit before it truly began. We talked about safe topics, his school, his friends, the soccer camp Sandra had enrolled him in for the remainder of summer, but I could sense something different about him, an alertness that hadn't been there before, as if he were paying attention to more than just our conversation. "Grandma Helen," he said suddenly, interrupting Sandra's monologue about his improved performance in swimming lessons, "do you like it here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, her hand moving to rest on Max's shoulder in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt possessive. "I'm sure Grandma Helen is very happy here," she said before I could answer. "Aren't you, Helen? All those activities and people your own age to talk to." People my own age. As if chronological similarity were an adequate substitute for genuine connection. "It's an adjustment," I said carefully, understanding that my answer was being evaluated for signs of discontent that might complicate Sandra's narrative. But Max was studying my face with the intensity of someone reading between lines, and I saw something in his expression that reminded me so strongly of his father at that age. The same focused intelligence that had made Michael such a perceptive child before adult concerns had dulled his empathy. "Mom," Max said, turning to Sandra with the kind of carefully casual tone children use when testing boundaries. "Can I give Grandma Helen a hug?" Sandra's hesitation was brief but telling. "Of course, sweetie, but let's not stay too long. Grandma Helen probably gets tired easily." Gets tired easily, at 55. As if aging were a contagious disease that required careful management. When Max hugged me, he pressed something small and hard into my palm, his fingers closing mine around it with the deliberate secrecy of someone passing classified information. His embrace lasted longer than Sandra's comfort level could tolerate, and when he pulled back, he looked directly into my eyes with an intensity that seemed far older than his 8 years. "I miss you, Grandma Helen," he said, his voice carrying weight that made Sandra shift uncomfortably in her chair. "I miss you too, sweetheart." After they left, I waited until I was safely back in my room before examining what Max had given me. It was a small piece of paper, folded multiple times into a tiny square, the kind of secret note children pass in school when they need to communicate without adult supervision. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, revealing Max's careful printing in blue crayon. "They think you can't hear them, but I do. They talk about your money and your house." I write it down. "Don't give up, Grandma. I love you." I read those words 10 times, each repetition hitting me like electricity, jolting me back to awareness of truths I'd been too devastated to recognize. "They talk about your money and your house." I write it down. For months, I'd been so focused on my emotional exile that I'd ignored the practical implications of my situation. I'd been so grateful for any scrap of inclusion, so desperate to avoid being more of a burden, that I'd stopped paying attention to the financial arrangements being made on my behalf. But Max had been listening. 8-year-old Max, dismissed as too young to understand adult conversations, had been documenting things that apparently concerned him enough to risk passing secret notes to his exiled grandmother. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow institutional bed, staring at the ceiling while Max's words echoed in my mind. Your money and your house. What exactly had they been discussing? What decisions had been made about my financial future while I'd been focused on trying not to be an emotional inconvenience? I thought back to the conversation about Golden Years Manor, the casual way Sandra had mentioned that my resources would cover the first 2 years. She'd presented it as a solution they'd calculated for my benefit. But what if it had been calculated for theirs? The next morning, I asked Beth about making a phone call. Private phone calls were allowed, she explained, though the phone was located in a public area where conversations could be easily overheard by staff and other residents. I called Robert's old financial advisor, a man named Frank Delacroix, who'd helped us manage our modest investments and insurance policies during the years before Robert's illness consumed our resources and attention. "Helen!" Frank's voice carried genuine warmth and surprise. "I was wondering when I might hear from you. How are you adjusting to your new living situation?" My new living situation. So he knew about Golden Years Manor. The question was, what else did he know? "Frank, I need to ask you about some financial matters. Robert's life insurance, the sale of our house. I'm realizing I may not have been paying as much attention as I should have been." The pause that followed was long enough to confirm my growing suspicions. "Helen," Frank said carefully, "I think we should schedule a time to meet in person. There are some documents you should review, some decisions that have been made that you might want to understand more fully. Decisions that have been made. Not decisions I had made, but decisions that had been made, presumably by someone with power of attorney or legal authority I didn't remember granting." "How soon can we meet?" I asked. "Tomorrow afternoon?" I can come to you if that's easier. The next day, Frank arrived at Golden Years Manor carrying a briefcase that seemed to contain the entire history of my financial existence. He was a kind man in his 60s who'd always treated Robert and me with respect and patience, never talking down to us despite our limited understanding of investment strategies and tax implications. But today, his usual warmth was tempered with something that looked like concern, even anger. "Helen," he began, spreading documents across the table in the common room, "I need you to understand what's been happening to your assets over the past few months." What followed was an education in how trust can be systematically betrayed by people who claim to love you. The house Robert and I had owned outright, paid off through 30 years of careful mortgage payments, had been sold 3 months ago. The proceeds, nearly $200,000, had been placed in an account with both my name and Michael's name, but with Michael holding primary control. Robert's life insurance policy, another $100,000 that was supposed to ensure my financial security, had been similarly structured, with Michael as the beneficiary who would manage the funds for my care. My Social Security payments, my small pension from the years I'd worked before becoming a full-time mother, even the modest savings account Robert and I had maintained for emergencies, all of it flowing into accounts I could access only with Michael's approval. "Frank," I said, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was telling me, "are you saying I have no independent control over my own money?" "I'm saying that someone convinced you to sign papers giving your son complete control over your financial assets. Papers that were presented as temporary arrangements to help with your transition to assisted living. Papers I didn't remember signing. Conversations I didn't remember having. Decisions I certainly didn't remember making." But I was beginning to remember something else. Sandra's voice drifting up through the heating vents, talking about finding a good place for me to live when they found the right one, planning my exile while I was still sleeping under their roof, still believing I was family rather than a financial asset to be managed and ultimately disposed of. That night, I sat in my room with Max's note and Frank's documents, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't grief. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't the desperate hope I'd been clinging to that somehow things might get better if I just became smaller and more accommodating. It was determination, cold, focused, and absolutely certain. They had underestimated me, and they had made a mistake. The first thing I did was stop taking their phone calls. When Michael called that Saturday morning, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness he'd perfected for managing unpleasant family obligations, I let it ring through to the nurse's station. When Sandra called an hour later, probably wondering why I hadn't answered Michael, I was in the common room, apparently absorbed in a book about gardening. "Helen has some visitors," Beth announced during lunch, her clipboard suggesting official business. "Your son and daughter-in-law are here." I looked up from my institutional meatloaf with the mild surprise of someone who'd genuinely forgotten they might come. "How nice," I said pleasantly. "Please tell them I'm not feeling well today. Perhaps next time." Beth's eyebrows raised slightly. In her experience, residents always welcomed family visits, no matter how brief or obligatory they might be. Declining to see your own children was unusual enough to warrant a note in my file, but I wasn't ready to see them yet. Not until I understood exactly what they'd done and had time to plan my response appropriately. That afternoon, I called Frank from the phone in the hallway, speaking quietly but with purpose. "Frank, I need you to research something for me. Those papers I supposedly signed, I want to know when they were dated, who witnessed them, and what the exact circumstances were when I allegedly gave my consent." "Helen, are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm gathering information. Can you do that for me?" While Frank investigated the legal aspects of my situation, I began my own research into Michael and Sandra's financial circumstances. It's amazing what you can learn about people when you start paying attention to details you've previously ignored. During their last visit, I'd noticed Sandra's new jewelry, a diamond tennis bracelet that certainly hadn't come from Michael's middle management salary. Her handbag was designer leather, the kind that costs more than most people spend on rent. Michael's watch was different too, upgraded from the simple Seiko he'd worn for years to something Swiss and expensive. I started making phone calls to people I hadn't spoken with in months. Old neighbors who might have observed the house sale. Church members who might have heard gossip about my situation. Even Margaret in Phoenix, whom I pressed for details about conversations we'd had during my early weeks at Michael's house. "You know, Helen," Margaret said during one of these calls, "there was something that bothered me about one of our talks. You mentioned that you'd signed some papers to help Michael manage your affairs temporarily, but you seemed confused about what they actually said. What do you remember exactly? You said Sandra had explained them to you, but that you'd been having trouble sleeping and maybe hadn't read everything as carefully as you should have. You were worried about being a burden, remember? You kept saying you just wanted to make things easier for everyone. Worried about being a burden. Wanting to make things easier. Of course. They'd waited until I was at my most vulnerable, grieving, and desperate for family connection, then presented their legal documents as acts of kindness rather than financial manipulation. I also began paying more attention to the conversations around me at Golden Years Manor. It turned out that my situation wasn't unique. 3 other residents had similar stories. Adult children who'd gained control of their parents' finances temporarily, and then found reasons why that temporary arrangement needed to become permanent. Eleanor, the woman who sat at my dinner table, had signed over her assets after a minor car accident that her daughter used as evidence she was no longer safe to live independently. It was supposed to be just until I recovered, Eleanor told me, her voice bitter with recognition. That was 2 years ago. William, who spent his days staring out the window at the parking lot, had given his son power of attorney after a hospitalization for pneumonia. He said it would make it easier to pay my bills while I was sick. Next thing I knew, my house was sold, and I was here. Patterns. That's what I was seeing. A systematic approach to elderly financial abuse that relied on loving children who decided their parents' independence was less important than their own financial security. But I had something these other victims didn't have. Max. My grandson visited again the following Sunday, this time accompanied by Michael instead of Sandra. Michael seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly and glancing at his watch, as if this hour with his displaced mother was time stolen from more important activities. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked dutifully, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. "I'm adapting," I said, studying his face for signs of guilt or concern. "Frank Delacroix stopped by earlier this week. Such a nice man. We had an interesting conversation about financial planning for elderly people." Something flickered across Michael's expression. Surprise? Maybe even alarm. "Frank? Why would he? What did you need to discuss with him?" "Oh, just reviewing my situation, making sure I understand all the arrangements that have been made on my behalf." I kept my voice light, conversational, but I saw Max's head turn toward me with sharp attention. "Mom, if you have questions about your finances, you should ask me. I'm managing everything according to what we discussed." What we discussed? As if I'd been a willing participant in my own financial dismantling. After Michael excused himself to take a phone call, apparently business couldn't wait even during his obligatory visit with his institutionalized mother, Max moved his chair closer to mine. "Grandma Helen," he whispered, glancing toward the doorway where his father's voice carried from the hallway. "I brought you something else." This time, it was a small notebook, the kind children use for school assignments. But the pages were filled with Max's careful handwriting, dates, times, and conversations he'd apparently been documenting for weeks. I flipped through it quickly, my heart pounding as I read entries like, July 15th, Mom told Dad that Grandma Helen's house money would pay for my college and her new car. July 22nd, Dad said Grandma Helen will never know the difference because old people don't understand money anyway. August 3rd, Mom said they should move Grandma Helen soon because her questions are getting annoying. Each entry was a small dagger, confirming what I'd begun to suspect but hadn't wanted to believe. My own son and daughter-in-law had been planning my exile while counting my money, dismissing my intelligence while spending my resources. But there was something else in Max's notebook that made my breath catch in my throat. Recent entries that suggested their plans extended beyond simple financial control. August 10th, Mom and Dad talked about selling Grandma Helen's jewelry. Mom said no one would miss it because Grandma Helen doesn't go anywhere fancy anymore. August 15th, Dad said Grandma Helen might be getting suspicious and they should be more careful about what they say around her. They were escalating. Not content with controlling my money, they were now planning to dispose of the few personal items I had left. And they were becoming cautious, which meant they suspected I might be catching on to their scheme. "Max," I whispered, taking his small hands in mine, "this notebook is very important. Can you keep writing in it, but hide it where your parents won't find it?" He nodded solemnly, understanding with the intuitive wisdom of children that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't fully grasp the adult complexities involved. "Are you going to be okay, Grandma Helen?" I looked into his earnest 8-year-old face, this beautiful child who'd been risking his parents' anger to document their betrayal, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, pleading hope I'd been clinging to, but something stronger and more purposeful. "Yes, sweetheart. I think I'm going to be just fine." That evening, I sat in my small room and wrote a letter I should have written months ago. Not to Michael or Sandra. They'd lost the right to direct communication when they'd chosen deception over honesty, but to someone who would understand the difference between justice and revenge, between protecting myself and punishing them. I addressed the envelope to Janet Morrison, Esquire, my college roommate who'd become a family law attorney, someone who'd built her career helping women navigate the legal complexities of domestic betrayal. The letter was simple and factual, outlining my situation without emotional embellishment. I included copies of the documents Frank had provided, Max's notebook entries, and a clear request for legal representation. At the bottom, I wrote, "I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in protection. For myself and for my grandson who deserves better than parents who teach him that elderly relatives are financial opportunities rather than family members deserving of love and respect." As I sealed the envelope, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there. It might always be there, but it no longer controlled me. It was time to remind my family who Helen Morrison really was, underneath the grief and desperation they'd exploited. It was time to show them that underestimating a woman who'd survived 55 years of life's challenges had been their first and most critical mistake. Janet Morrison arrived at Golden Years Manor on a Tuesday morning, carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to fighting battles other people didn't know they were capable of winning. I hadn't seen my college roommate in 15 years, but she looked exactly as I'd expected. Silver hair pulled back in a professional chignon, a well-tailored suit that suggested success without ostentation, and eyes that had learned to see through the lies people told themselves about their own motives. "Hello, Helen," she said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair with the composure of someone who'd conducted difficult conversations in worse settings. "I've reviewed your documents. We need to talk." What followed was a 2-hour education in how the law could be used to protect people who'd been too trusting, too grief-stricken, or too desperate for family connection to protect themselves. "The power of attorney documents you signed," Janet explained, spreading papers across the table with surgical precision, "were obtained under what we call undue influence. You were grieving, financially dependent, and emotionally vulnerable when these papers were presented to you. But I did sign them. Yes, but the circumstances matter. Michael and Sandra had a duty to ensure you understood what you were signing, that you had independent legal counsel, that you weren't being coerced by your living situation or emotional state. They failed that duty spectacularly." Janet had done more than review documents. She'd investigated Michael and Sandra's financial activities since gaining control of my assets, and what she'd discovered was even worse than I'd feared. Not only had they used my money to upgrade their lifestyle, the jewelry, the car payments, the private school tuition for Max that I'd never agreed to fund, but they'd also been systematically selling my possessions and keeping the proceeds. My grandmother's china set, which I'd assumed was safely stored in their basement, had been sold to an antique dealer for $3,000. Robert's workshop tools, accumulated over 30 years of weekend projects, had been auctioned off for another $2,000. Even my wedding dress, carefully preserved in its original box, had been sold to a vintage clothing store. "They've been liquidating your personal history," Janet said bluntly, "and treating the proceeds as their own income." But Janet had also done something I hadn't expected. She'd contacted the state attorney general's office about patterns of elder financial abuse in our area. My case wasn't isolated, and there was growing interest in prosecuting these kinds of systematic exploitation schemes. "Helen, you have options. We can file for reversal of the power of attorney on grounds of fraud and undue influence. We can seek restitution for the money they've spent and the property they've sold. And if you're willing, we can cooperate with a criminal investigation into elder abuse. Criminal investigation. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, transforming my personal betrayal into something larger and more serious. What would that mean for Max? I asked. Because despite everything, the thought of my grandson losing his parents to prison terrified me more than my own losses. That depends on Michael and Sandra's response to our initial demands. If they're willing to make full restitution and return control of your assets, the criminal matter might be resolved with probation and community service. If they fight us, if they continue to claim they were acting in your best interests— Janet shrugged with the eloquent gesture of someone who'd seen stubborn defendants make their situations much worse. We scheduled the confrontation for the following Friday afternoon. Janet would serve them with legal documents demanding immediate restoration of my financial independence, while I would finally tell my son and daughter-in-law exactly what I thought of their care and concern. The intervening days passed with an electricity I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't angry, exactly. Anger was too simple for the complex emotions I was processing. I was sad for the people Michael and Sandra had revealed themselves to be. I was disappointed in my own naivety, but underneath it all, I was determined to ensure that their betrayal ended here, with me, and didn't continue with other vulnerable family members they might target in the future. Friday arrived gray and rainy, weather that seemed appropriate for the kind of conversation that would leave relationships permanently altered. Michael and Sandra arrived exactly on time, their faces showing the kind of controlled concern that suggested they knew this meeting was more serious than my usual complaints about institutional life. "Mom," Michael said, settling into his chair with the cautious politeness of someone approaching a potentially dangerous animal. "You sounded upset on the phone. What's going on?" I studied his face. This man who'd once been my little boy, who'd run to me with scraped knees and homework problems, who'd called me his best friend until he'd learned that mothers were supposed to be embarrassing rather than important. "I've been doing some research, Michael," I said quietly, "learning about my financial situation. It's been very educational." Sandra's hand moved instinctively to her new bracelet, her fingers covering the diamonds, as if my gaze could somehow reveal their illicit origin. "Mom, if you have questions about your finances, we've told you that you're managing everything according to what we discussed." "Yes, I remember you saying that. The problem is, Michael, I don't remember any such discussion." The silence that followed was charged with the recognition that we were no longer pretending everything was fine. This wasn't a social visit with complaints about the food or requests to go home. This was a reckoning. "Helen," Sandra said carefully, "you were very upset after Robert's death. You might not remember all the conversations we had about making sure you'd be taken care of." "You're right, Sandra. My grief might have affected my memory about many things. That's why I asked Janet Morrison to help me review the legal documents you had me sign." I gestured toward the hallway, where Janet had been waiting for her cue. She entered with the measured pace of someone comfortable with confrontation, carrying a briefcase that suddenly made the visiting room feel like a courtroom. "Michael, Sandra," Janet said pleasantly, setting her briefcase on the table and removing a thick folder. "I'm Janet Morrison, representing Helen in matters related to the management of her financial assets." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Michael's face cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that looked like panic. Sandra went very still, her trained social smile freezing into something that resembled a death mask. "I don't understand," Michael said, looking between Janet and me as if we'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Mom, why do you need a lawyer? We're family." "That's exactly why she needs a lawyer," Janet replied smoothly, opening her folder to reveal documents that would reshape our family dynamics forever. Because family members who exploit their relatives' trust are often the hardest cases to prosecute. What followed was 45 minutes of legal precision that cut through months of lies and manipulation with surgical efficiency. Janet presented evidence of financial abuse so comprehensive that denial was impossible. Bank records showing my money funding their lifestyle upgrades, sales receipts for my personal property that had been liquidated without my knowledge or consent, even photographs of Sandra wearing jewelry purchased with my inheritance money. The power of attorney you obtained, Janet explained to Michael, was signed by a grieving woman who'd just lost her husband and was desperate to maintain family connections. She was living in your home, financially dependent on your goodwill, and emotionally vulnerable to suggestions that signing these documents would prove she trusted you. We were trying to help her, Sandra protested, but her voice lacked conviction. By selling her wedding dress? By liquidating her late husband's tools? By using her inheritance to pay for private school tuition you couldn't otherwise afford? Janet's voice remained professionally neutral, but each question landed like a physical blow. Michael had gone very pale. Mom, we never meant. We thought you'd be taken care of here. We thought you'd be happier with people your own age. You thought I'd be too confused or too grateful to notice that you were stealing from me, I said quietly. And you were almost right. The legal demands were clear and non-negotiable. Full restoration of my financial independence within 30 days, restitution for all money spent and property sold, and my immediate discharge from Golden Years Manor to living arrangements of my own choosing. If these demands aren't met, Janet concluded, we'll be filing criminal charges for elder financial abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The State Attorney General's office is very interested in this case. After Janet left and Michael and Sandra sat in stunned silence, I leaned forward and spoke the words I'd been rehearsing for days. I loved you both, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. I trusted you with my life, my money, and my grandson's future. You repaid that trust by treating me like an inconvenience to be managed and a bank account to be emptied. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. You have 30 days to fix this. All of it. And then we'll discuss what kind of relationship, if any, we'll have going forward. They left without another word, Sandra clutching her stolen bracelet, Michael carrying the weight of consequences he'd never expected to face. That evening, I sat in my small room and felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. I felt like myself again. 28 days later, I walked out of Golden Years Manor carrying a small suitcase and the keys to my new apartment. A bright, two-bedroom place with a garden view, and enough space for the furniture I'd chosen myself. Michael and Sandra had met every one of Janet's demands. My financial accounts had been restored to my sole control, with interest. The money they'd spent on their lifestyle upgrades had been repaid from Michael's retirement fund. The items they'd sold were replaced with equivalent pieces or cash settlements that allowed me to rebuild what they'd destroyed. But more than that, they'd given me something I'd thought was lost forever. My grandson. The custody arrangement Janet had negotiated wasn't traditional, but it was fair. Max would spend every other weekend with me, plus 2 weeks during school breaks. More importantly, Michael and Sandra were required to attend family counseling sessions that would help them understand how their actions had damaged not just me, but their son's ability to trust the adults in his life. Grandma Helen, Max said on our first official weekend together, sitting at my new kitchen table while I made his favorite snickerdoodles from memory. I was scared they were going to make you disappear forever. They tried, sweetheart, I said, measuring cinnamon with the precision of someone who'd baked these cookies hundreds of times. But sometimes adults forget that love isn't something you can just throw away, even when people hurt you. My new apartment was in a senior-friendly building, but not a care facility. I had neighbors my own age who'd chosen to live here because they wanted community without surrendering independence. There was Eleanor, a retired librarian who'd moved here after her husband's death because she wanted to travel without worrying about maintaining a house. There was Frank, a widowed carpenter who'd downsized but kept a workshop in the basement where he taught furniture repair to anyone interested in learning. These were people who understood that aging meant adapting, not disappearing. I joined the building's book club, where my opinions were welcomed rather than tolerated. I started a small garden on the communal patio, where residents could grow herbs and vegetables if they wanted to cook with fresh ingredients. I even began volunteering at a local legal aid clinic, helping other elderly people understand their rights when family members tried to help them in ways that felt more like control. Margaret visited from Phoenix for Thanksgiving, her first trip to see me since Robert's death. We cooked dinner together in my new kitchen, using recipes I'd reconstructed from memory and techniques I'd learned from trial and error. You seem different, she observed, watching me roll out pie crust with the confidence of someone who'd rediscovered her own competence. Stronger, More like the Helen I remember from before. Before. We didn't need to specify before what. Before grief had made me vulnerable. Before loneliness had made me grateful for scraps of inclusion. Before I'd forgotten that being needed was different from being wanted, and that family relationships built on obligation rather than love were destined to become prisons. The hardest conversation came 6 months later, when Michael asked if we could meet for coffee. Not at my apartment, not at his house, but at a neutral cafe where we could speak as adults rather than as parent and child, trapped in roles that no longer served either of us. He looked older, I realized, studying his face across the small table. The stress of legal consequences and financial restitution had etched new lines around his eyes. But there was something else there too, something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. "Mom," he began, then stopped, apparently struggling with words he'd never expected to need. "I don't know how to apologize for what we did." "Then don't apologize, Michael. Apologies are for mistakes, for accidents, for moments of poor judgment. What you and Sandra did was systematic and deliberate." He flinched as if I'd struck him, but he didn't argue. "You're right. We convinced ourselves we were helping you, but really we were helping ourselves to your money and your trust. And my grandson's respect for his parents," I added quietly. "Max has learned that the adults he depends on are capable of lies and betrayal. That's going to affect him for the rest of his life." Michael's composure cracked slightly. "He barely talks to us anymore. The family counselor says he's lost trust in our authority because he knows we were wrong about something important." "Good," I thought but didn't say. Max needed to understand that authority based on power rather than wisdom was always temporary, always vulnerable to truth. "What do you want from me, Michael?" I asked. "Forgiveness? Relationship restoration? Pretending this never happened so Max can grow up in a family that looks normal from the outside? I want—" He struggled, then met my eyes with something that looked like the honesty I'd raised him to value. "I want to deserve your forgiveness someday. I don't expect it now. Maybe not ever. But I want to become someone who could earn it." For the first time in our conversation, I felt a flicker of hope for my son's character. Not forgiveness. That would take time and evidence of real change. But recognition that the person I'd raised was still somewhere inside the man who'd betrayed me. "Then start by being honest with Max about what you did and why it was wrong," I said. "Start by showing him that adults can acknowledge their mistakes and work to repair the damage they've caused." 2 years later, as I write this story, Max is 10 years old and splitting his time between parents who are learning to rebuild his trust and a grandmother who's learned the difference between being needed and being valued. I live in my bright apartment with my garden view and my chosen community. I have enough money to be comfortable without being dependent. I have relationships built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. I have legal documents that protect my independence and ensure that no one can ever again use my love against me. Most importantly, I have my voice back. Not the pleading voice that begged for inclusion, not the grateful voice that accepted crumbs of attention, but the clear, strong voice of someone who knows her own worth and refuses to settle for less than she deserves. Sandra and I maintain cordial distance. She nods when we pass at Max's school events. She includes me in family photos when necessary, but she's never again confused my grief-driven desperation with actual weakness. And I've never again confused her tolerance with genuine acceptance. The real victory isn't that I got my money back or my independence restored. The real victory is that I remembered who I was before circumstances made me forget my own value. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who'll exploit that love the most cruelly. I learned that family connections based on guilt and obligation are more fragile than relationships built with strangers who choose to care about you. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to stop accepting less than you deserve, even from people who share your blood. To anyone listening who recognizes themselves in this story, whether you're the grandmother being marginalized, the parent being taken advantage of, or the child watching adults behave badly, remember this: silence isn't peace, and keeping family secrets isn't loyalty. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable people's worst impulses, even when those people are family. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help, even when pride tells you to suffer in silence. And sometimes the most important lesson you can teach the children in your life is that love without respect isn't really love at all. I'm Helen Morrison, and I learned that my voice matters, especially when I use it to protect myself and the people I truly love. The end.